I'll go ahead and get started. So as Beta said, my name is Benjamin Daniels. I'm a research fellow at Georgetown University, and I also work at the World Bank Group as a data coordinator with the Development Impact Evaluation Group. I'm going to share some materials right away from my work with that team as part of the motivation. You may know or have seen that we have a new book out on a lot of these materials called Development Research in Practice, which is a handbook on how to do all of the steps in empirical data work, particularly around development, which has been, our area of expertise for a very long time. And we really motivate a lot of these practices and a lot of the work that we've done around the topics of the lecture today, which are reproducibility, transparency, and credibility in research. So the reason for this, and the reason why you can see in the diagram throughout all of the kind of practical components of the work, we use that framework as an overarching theme and an overarching motivator. The reason for this is so that people who are in the end consuming your research can see the quality of the data, which is especially important when the data is coming from the research team rather than from a third-party source. Can understand how the data that was collected or generated corresponds to the study design and the research objectives, and allows other people in the same organization or in different groups to reuse or modify data and code to test alternative hypotheses. So we really try to start from this idea that if you use these principles of reproducibility, transparency, and credibility as a motivating framework for the practical elements of research design, not only does it make your research more useful and believable to consumers, but it also makes the work easier for you to do because it's designed in a way that's meant to be easily understood and reused, which often applies to the own research teams. Another way of saying that is that we don't believe in research quality police or research reproducibility police. We don't think doing this is an extra chore on top of the work that you already need to be doing, which is a very common kind of pushback that we hear from teams where we start introducing these kind of practices. We think that looking forward throughout the whole research design to having open research makes it actually easier. Yes, there's a learning curve, but that's why we are offering trainings and specific tools and practices designed to implement reproducible research practices throughout the research workflow, and why we take time to explain, standardize, and develop these. So that in fact, it does reduce the workload on the researchers at the end of the day. The kind of immediate motivation for the introduction of these practices into a lot of people's workflow, though, is what feels like reproducibility police, right? A lot of journals, especially major journals, namely AAA journals here, which make up some of the top and most popular journals in the field, do expect and do require the publication of data and code that reproduces the analytical work. This is, again, motivated through the same principles that they want their readers to be able to obtain the original data and code and both validate and modify those for other work. But it is work. Putting together a publication package for data and code, which is the kind of baseline for a reproducible research output, takes a bit of finagling, and especially if it hasn't been, if the research work hasn't been done in that way from the very beginning, it can be a lot of retrofitting and a lot of additional work to make the materials conform to those kind of standards and actually work for the publication requirements. So again, we want to start with that mindset from way before we ever talk about releasing or publishing a research product and the associated packages, so that this actually doesn't become any additional work for researchers and feels very natural and is well thought ahead and is actually feels like an accomplishment and an additional thing that comes out of the research as another research product. So we'll cover at the very minimum, how these kinds of packages are typically organized, the types of copyright and licensing that will apply to them, and what needs to be made aware of for the research team, both upstream and as the publication for research outputs approaches, whether or not you're doing it through a third-party publisher, and who's going to be responsible for each of these things on a typical research team. So as you know, as it's running through if it's a academic journal, it's almost always going to be the author's responsibility to put these materials together, and then publishers may or may not have their own confirmation or review requirements for these kinds of materials with publication. So how do we typically organize these tasks among research teams? Obviously, the principal investigators on teams are going to be responsible for conceptual level and research level tasks, developing and documenting the research designs and the type of data that they're going to want to get hold of, guiding the research team in setting up and completing project registrations, pre-registrations, or other commitment devices, which we'll also cover in a minute. Understanding rights and responsibilities, especially legal rights and responsibilities surrounding the data, the code, and the research outputs. And determining what types of research pre-commitment is appropriate up front. Research assistants or staff will obviously do most of the work in a lot of these cases, adjusting outputs and documentations, letting leadership know when materials are incomplete, and making sure that they have a handle on the technical practices of reproducible and transparent research. When it comes time to actually put those materials together into a research product for publication, the PIs are going to make sure that the right types of outputs are being generated, that the legal documentation was obtained and is in order for all of the data and understands the same for code and research publication, figures out where and how to publish all this stuff, and verifies that the replication package works and is appropriate for release. Again, the research assistants and staff are going to do most of this stuff. They're going to prepare the code, data, and documentation for the technical requirements, make sure that collaborative documents and research reproducibility packages are ready to publish, and go through revision processes to have these in an acceptable state for the publisher to release. So any questions here about the high-level overview of what the framework is, how we're going to approach it, and what the kind of practical elements are gonna consist of? Yeah, jump in anytime if you have questions about some of the specifics. So we'll start from the very, very beginning of the project, developing a credible research project. So the reason that we need to do this from the outset is we want to make sure that designs can be believed. In theory and in the past, a lot of the credibility of research results would come from the design itself. We would talk about things like sample size and power, the plausibility of control groups, things like structural models, design of sampling randomization, all the things that go into the identification section if you're writing an econ paper. But as we found out, as things become more and more empirical, people are collecting more of their own data, implementing more of their own experiments. There are a lot of micro level decisions corresponding to any high level experimental design that can be changed during research for most any broadly defined design. So we have here a famous example from literature where we tie ourselves to the mast so that we can't change some of our most important decisions while we're doing them. In practice, that means our research designer needs some kind of commitment and proof to lock down some of the elements of flexibility we might have. Again, we're not going to come and approach these issues from the perspective that people are actually going to be doing things that are wrong, that you're going to be trying to, fraudulently control your research design or make decisions that are advantageous to you. But a lot of it is just going to be a practice of documentation of the decisions that are made in sufficient detail to protect ourselves from the happy coincidence of getting the results that we might like. So we're going to write down as many of those details as possible. We have three main ways of doing this in research design. These are registering research, pre-analysis planning or pre-registering materials, and offering a formally published registered report so that even more of the details of research can be locked down. I'm going to cover each of these in practice. So registering research is simply the process of documenting that we are doing a study. There's never any reason not to register research. You can do this right up until the day you publish it, and you absolutely should. There are lots of appropriate catalogs for different disciplines where you can have these, and the purpose of doing this is to create a record of all the studies that have been done so new scholars can find them easily, find their data and outputs easily, and ensure that the whole body of research is accessible without painstaking searching. It's also it's now very common to pre-register research, which is to do this before undertaking the study, to, again, start locking in some of the details. It's not very complicated. It's always free, and you can always add these details as they develop. So this is not a heavy lift to just write down that you're doing something. And it's expected for most materials. So again, happy to offer specific advice on how to do that and where to do that, depending on the research design and the area. And again, pre-registration is now becoming super common, especially for funders and stuff like that. Pre-analysis planning, right, is a slightly more detailed approach to the same thing. We're going to ask most of our research teams to develop pretty detailed pre-analysis plans. There are two major reasons why we ask them to do this. One, of course, is for the definitions of the concepts and outcomes and measurements that are going to be collected and understood. And the second is going to be statistical specifications, right? Because these two things are some of the easiest things to change a little here and change a little there, or make a set of interlocking decisions as you move through the research project that could sometimes be construed as again, being taken advantage of. And it is easy to take advantage of if you're trying to do that. We also expect that this is not that difficult, namely because in order to get funding for most research designs, you have to prepare something that's pretty close anyway. A funding proposal or a concept note or some kind of similar technical document that has a pretty high level of detail about what is actually going to be done during the course of the study. Any experiments that are going to be done, any data that's going to be collected. And a pre-analysis plan, and again, a registered pre-analysis plan, a published pre-analysis plan, simply takes that further by adding the level of technical specificity to that doesn't appear in a design document or an investment proposal or something of that sort, right? More of a technical approach. And so we do expect these going farther than that and adding more specific details and contingencies is not necessary and can take a lot of time. But if you're doing something novel or something that you think would be very easy to manipulate statistically, it does protect you from those criticisms later. And we don't expect people to do this in a way that's going to prevent them from taking the results of experiments and data collections that they do and limiting them to finding new things, but it protects the things that you're most interested in when you design the study. Now, the third thing we talk about is registered reports. Registered reports are fairly new, and they really do take the design pre-specification as far as it can go. In a registered report, which are offered by certain publishers and journals, we write out almost a whole paper in advance, rather than having a kind of more abstract description. Maybe we know the structure of the data or can predict the structure of the data. We can write some of the exact specifications and tables that we're going to produce, and then we can fill them in when the data comes in. So this is, again, very uncommon at the moment, but very powerful way to both get feedback and peer review for the entire experimental design that we want to run. And also in most cases, when registered reports are offered, it guarantees the acceptance of a follow-up paper with the results because they've already been decided that they are done well and that they're interesting. Places where this is particularly valuable is if you may be afraid that there are pressures on the results of your experiment, such as having a result for a particular program or intervention, and null and negative results are very common. Or again, just something that's really novel and has a lot of flexibility that you want to hammer down and get peer review on before you open up the data. So those are our three main methods of commitment that we're approaching now. And we want people to start taking those seriously and exploring them as they go through research design. When we move into actually doing the research, no matter how much you've committed to in advance, there's always going to be ongoing decisions. This is referred to in the literature as the Garden of Forking Paths, after the famous story. And no matter how well you think you have planned out the entire process, there are going to be choices. Do I exclude this observation? Do I cancel this treatment arm? How do I combine these measures into an aggregate measure or a conceptual measure? Which of these observations seem wrong? Which of these things are outliers and shouldn't be included in final observation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for each of those choices, you're led down a series of interactions where even a small number of choices can end up with a pretty wide range of final results. So again, we don't ask that people spend an enormous amount of time in advance thinking through every single one of these possibilities, but just that we write them down and that we justify them so that other people can analyze them, understand them, and if they think that something else would be interesting, that they can change them and try them out. So the process of documenting the decisions that are made throughout research using an actual kind of documentation process is very useful, and we do expect most projects to have that, even if it's not publicly released with research presentations. It should be stored and available with data and with those kinds of materials. So we want these not only to be able to go back and check our own work and for other people to go back and understand our work, but to make it easier for people to do this, to understand the papers and research results that we put out without having to send us an email to understand what a certain term is, why a certain decision was made, why something in our research product doesn't match our pre-specified design, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we want people to be able to access these as an independent product without our help. So this, again, can be a pretty comprehensive document. Sometimes we write it up as an appendix to major papers that if they've had a large, field component where we go through things. And we also sometimes store, different analytical versions of materials through version control, such as GitHub, so that people can access analytical histories of code as well when we want that to be available. We always want to use specifically designed software and processes for this. We call this a lab notebook in most disciplines. This is not email. This is not Slack, because these things are not designed for other people to access and read. Right. A lab notebook can be something as simple as an issue tracker or a task board where decision points are posted to the team, have a discussion, are permanently signed off and archived, and can be made easily available to others to understand and explore. That's all we really ask. It's not complicated. Again, these are discussions that are being had anyway. And so the main innovation here is, the way to organize it in terms of software. We use Git a lot for this, or GitHub, to organize these decisions and memorialize the conversations and outcomes. And that works really well, especially if you're working on active code-based development for data cleaning or data analysis. Similarly, we want to have really clear and explicit and organized documentation of data sources and their contents. Use and reuse permissions are now becoming very important as data are collected either from or in partnership with third-party organizations, including private companies, including governments, including international organizations, survey firms, and so on. Establishing explicit ownership and use, redistribution, and licensing permissions for these is extremely important. Similarly, documenting the actual process of data collection, whether or not it was done by you, a second party, or a third party, to understand the patterns in data, where data are, where data aren't, and what data mean. Finally, we expect the retention of original data as it was received, either during data collection or during a data transfer. And we want that to be archived always and released, published if possible. It doesn't have to be publicly released, but it does have to be available, and we expect data citations that allow people to retrieve that original material. After that, including publishing and releasing the code that's necessary to clean or construct the final research data that you use for your study from the original data received is very easy, because that code is usually not sensitive and is not owned by anyone else. And it allows people to very easily examine and edit choices that are made about the use of the original data once they get hold of it. So these are the main things that we have to do upfront and during the research study to ensure that we have documented all of the steps that we took to get from design to data to analysis, and to make these available to other researchers and to the public, so that our research can be really understood and reused. Any questions about that setup or those processes before I move into the second half, which is actually doing data work reproducibility and preparing the types of release packages for reproducibility that are now typically expected. Okay, so to reiterate, a big part of what we want in reproducibility is making your own work accessible. It means writing things in a way that other people can understand. If they can't do that, then you're handing them a black box. If your code is unreadable, if your code takes an enormous amount of work to decipher, if it doesn't naturally indicate to people either through the structure, the style, the comments, the syntax, where the important research questions are being made and where the important assumptions and models are being implemented and how they can be changed, it's not useful to other people. It's not reproducible. It's not accessible. When we're getting towards that step of publishing these research outputs, we're going to create a reproducibility package. And we're going to take this as seriously as if it was the manuscript itself. We're going to create code books detailing the structure of what's in the package and what's in the data. We're going to split up code and re-edit it so that it is accessible to even the most junior person on the coding team. We're going to restructure things so that they have a more logical flow in publication than they have in draft. We're going to write README files documenting what different components of the package do. We're going to clean up all the junk and temp file stuff that gets created during different drafts so that it doesn't clutter the drives of other people and distract them from what's actually important. And we're going to make sure it runs for at least one person who's never run it. Basically, all of these things that it takes to make the work usable. We're also going to make sure that these things are accessible in a kind of physical and practical way. We have that responsibility to make data and code available to others without putting the burden on them to reach out to us, to find it, to do anything more than follow our instructions that are given with the research product. When we store that data in code, we want to go back to where we were when we collected it. This should already be on file. We need to have that licensing and documentation of the original data as it was received before any of the analytical processes started. And that should be very clear in the data record. We should have those tools, the code tools that document the progression from the original data to the analytical data that we used for the research product. And all these materials should be stored in an archival fashion, typically with a third party or with your institution, not on personal drives, not on personal cloud drives, and not on anything that couldn't be made accessible to an individual without your cooperation, without contacting you. So those are the overarching principles of these packages. So what do we actually have to do to prepare the materials, the contents of these packages for release with our research projects? Well, first we need to think of them as research outputs, including research data, original data that we collected or received as the course of our research. These data may have strict access requirements, they may have embargoes, they may not be redistributable at all because they're owned by somebody else or co-owned with another research partner. As you can see, that's very common, particularly at institutions like the World Bank that are collaborating with others to collect this data. They typically release data in such a way that it needs to be requested, but it is hosted, stored, and the licensing is maintained through this permanent archive at the bank that can always be searched by outside parties to show the existence of the data and the licensing and the steps that would be needed to obtain original data if it's possible. These also include the citations that should be used that show people who are reading derivative research products, policy research documents, where this data is coming from, and how it would be accessed if they wanted to go and obtain this original data. So again, this step is very easy. You don't have to do anything at all. You've already collected the data, so it simply needs to be stored with its licensing after it's been received and the intake process has been completed. Again, the licensing is very important at this stage. If you look through the World Bank licensing variants, there are lots of ways that it can be stored, and these can be developed to meet the specific needs of you, your organization, and your collaborators or data providers. But this should absolutely be documented before data is obtained, so you have a clear view of the rights and responsibilities, whether and how you can release and redistribute data materials and derivative data, and how it can be used by future recipients. At this stage, we also typically want to de-identify data, particularly if we're going to release it, because we're not, in most cases, allowed to pass on any kind of data containing personally identifying information for research subjects. This includes combinations of variables that could re-identify people. There are tools such as SDC Micro that help you assess and reduce re-identification risk, but it's not something that we can generally sketch out in advance because such identifiers are unique to each project and unique to the level of risk in each context. So in most cases, for example, we don't want to release things like village names when anonymized village IDs would do. But if the project is specific to the level that, say, we're working in a known refugee camp or migrant situation, and it's not possible to hide the general geographic locations of things, it may be more important to hide or otherwise mask data like genders, ages, and things like family structures so that people can't be easily re-identified from the data when the likelihood of that working is high and also the risk is high and the context is sensitive. In others, this may be much less true. Right, for example, if we're working with public officials who may already be publicly listed, with their salaries, the information that would be sensitive for private individuals may already be public information. We still need to make sure that those data don't accidentally lead people to sensitive information. For example, if public official salaries are public, as they are in many contexts, then releasing data with those salaries reveals who they are and can link them to survey responses, for example, that may be intended to be confidential. So again, a different context has a very different type of risk and a very different type of risk mitigation is required to make sure that we aren't releasing sensitive identification that's linkable to research subjects. Once we move on from that data, we have the final data that we used for our research projects, which is usually derived from that. This contains a lot of the higher level constructs, the indicators that we've built for our specific project, and the exact samples that we're going to use for our work. This package, again, may be governed by the licensing restrictions from the original data. It should include the code that's needed to derive it from the original data that was published separately on that third party or independent repository. And this package may or may not fall under copyright for the publishing group, as well as the original data licensors or owners. So do check those requirements when submitting, and almost every publisher will have a legal office that will help you figure out how to do this. Sometimes these will be published with the publisher of the research project, or the author may be required to take responsibility for this and publish it separately, which would put it outside the copyright of the publisher, and it may be required to be published in something like OSF, which is a third-party archival source and supports CC0 and public domain publishing for these kinds of packagings. That'll include basically all the materials that are required to recreate your final analyses, right? The code required to get from the original data to the final data, the research outputs, the terms of use, licenses, analysis code, and documentation for that project. Any questions about the way that the data here should be handled or prepared for publication in these packages? Great. The last part that typically needs to be put out is the code. The code is the material, of course, that takes that data and translates it into the research results that made it into your research product, your publication, your policy brief, or whatever the final material is that we're talking about here. This contains all of that material needed to retain all of your results. These are now not at the level of the project, where the data, the original data might fall at the level of the project, but these fall at the level of the research output. So there will be a package for a paper, a package for a policy brief, a package for this, anything that comes out is going to be set up and maintained separately with all the materials needed to retrieve it from the original data. That way, each of these is a modular element and can be run separately without affecting the results of the other outputs. Just like we think of data as a research output, we're going to think of our code as a research output. This means it should be written well. It should be re-edited after the results are finalized so that it's clear and easy to navigate. Folder and file names should be organized and standardized. We should add comments so that readers can go through our code and understand what each section does and how it can be changed and how it meshes with the research design and with the outputs that are in the paper. And it should allow people to find outputs from the code and identify the code that goes with specific outputs without any more detailed work or reading of the code. Typical ways to handle this are to use GitHub's and Zenodo's first-party integration to create a third-party archival space for code. We typically do that when we finalize projects because GitHub itself is not an archive, but we can create those archival releases of code using that integration. This code is modular, meaning that each one can be run separately and people don't have to run long blocks of code to test changes to individual files and outputs. But it, at the very least, it requires data construction to be separate from analysis, data to be reloaded for each output, and those output structures to be very cleanly organized and annotated through the use of comments. We have lots of examples online in reproducibility packages. We have lots of examples in the book that I mentioned earlier, and especially in the reproducibility package for the example project in that book. And we absolutely recommend you going on and testing those out so you can see how these work in practice and how these things are published when we do that. Finally, when we release the reproducibility package, we have similar requirements to anything else. It needs to be archival, which is hosted by a third party or an institutional website that promises to stay online. These are some free third-party sites that are in common use. You have to specify licenses for that. This is typically easy for code because you almost always own the code and can put it in the public domain without any concerns about privacy or identifiability. And we provide documentation such as README materials to accompany all the releases so that people can understand what's going on. So those are the main technical requirements. Again, I want to re-summarize most of the material that I've done today. We want to make everything ultimately accessible to ourselves and to others. Things need to run on other people's computers, whether that's our computer in the future, whether that's another teammate's computer, whether that's a third-party reviewer's computer, or whether that's a researcher in 10 years' computer. It's okay to have specific software requirements as long as we minimize those to a reasonable degree. And everything should be structured and documented to be readable the same way that you would edit a final research product or manuscript. This goes all the way back to the design stage when we want people to be able to identify, understand, and change the research decisions that characterize our project and our study and our research design. And critical inputs, those research decisions that we committed to in our pre-analysis plans, in our research registrations, should stand out and be easy for people to identify and alter. And the main results for our materials should be easy to identify with the outputs and the code sections that generate them. Finally, this should all stand independently of you. No one should be coming back to ask you, what is this? How does this work? How do I run this? What does this mean? Everything should be clearly linked through plain language descriptions in READMEs for all the data, the environment setup, and the code that we're going to actually execute and how in order to run these. So that's the material I have prepared. I'm going to provide with the slides a list of the suggested readings that we think supports these materials really well for both of the sections. So please do take some time to go through these. They have a lot of both theoretical and practical descriptions of the world that we work in and the requirements that we operate under. And that's the presentation I have prepared. So as promised, I've used a little under 45 minutes for the session. We have about a half an hour left for discussion and Q&A. So let me give it back if there's any other notes or comments before that, and then I'm happy to chat for the next 20-30 minutes on pretty much any topics you want, practical or theoretical questions, stuff relating to your own research, or anything that you want to discuss.